The first time Ada Holloway heard the name Clayton Carver, it was spoken in the same hushed tone that people used when they talked about rattlesnakes and dry lightning, with a specific and personal kind of dread. She had arrived in Red Rock Crossing, New Mexico Territory, in the late spring of 1878, stepping down from the stagecoach onto a main street that was all dust and splinterwood and sun-bleached signboards. Her trunk had been tied on top of the coach with a length of fraying rope, and when the driver threw it down to the ground, one of the iron hinges cracked clean off and scattered into the dirt. She had knelt to collect the pieces without fuss, pressing her lips together in a straight line the way her mother had taught her. That is, you meet the small indignities of life with composure, because the large ones will come along soon enough to take your breath away. She was 26 years old. She had dark brown hair that she wore pulled back at the nape of her neck, and gray eyes that people sometimes mistook for blue until the light shifted and showed them otherwise. She was not remarkable in any way that announced itself immediately, but there was something about the steadiness of her gaze that made people who were in the habit of talking too much feel suddenly self-conscious about it. She had come to Red Rock Crossing because there was a position available at the town's only school, which held lessons in a cramped adobe building 3 days a week for the 17 children whose parents could be persuaded to send them. The previous teacher, a young man from Ohio named Mr. Prescott, had lasted exactly 4 months before he had packed his belongings and taken the next stage east without a single word of explanation. Ada had read the posting in a newspaper in Santa Fe, where she had been working as a seamstress for a dry goods merchant, and something about the flat plainness of the advertisement had appealed to her. Needed, a schoolteacher, must be capable, must be willing. She was both of those things. She had been both of those things since she was old enough to understand that they were requirements of survival rather than virtues. The woman who ran the boarding house, a wide and cheerful widow named Mrs. Eunice Graber, met Ada at the door with a cup of coffee that was still warm and a piece of pound cake that was not quite stale, and it was Mrs. Graber who first mentioned Clayton Carver's name. She mentioned it the way you might point out a storm cloud on the horizon, not because there was anything to be done about it, but because it would be careless not to. "You will see him in town," Mrs. Graber said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table and settling herself into it with the comfortable authority of a woman in her own home. "He comes in every couple of weeks for supplies. Flour, coffee, maybe some nails or harness leather. He does not speak to anyone and nobody speaks to him. That is the arrangement and it works well enough." Ada wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "What sort of man is he, Mrs.?" Graber considered this as though she had never quite put it to herself so directly before. "He was a rancher, has a spread about 8 miles northeast of town. The Double C it was called when he ran it properly. Had a wife. Had a good name, people say, though I didn't know him in those days myself. I came here after." She paused, straightening the edge of the tablecloth. "His wife died. A fever, they say. Some say it was grief that took her before the fever ever got the chance, that she had already gone quiet inside before her body gave out. They lost a child first, you see, a little boy. He was 3 years old." Ada was quiet for a moment. "When was that?" 5 years ago, give or take. "And he has not been the same man since, according to those who knew him before. Won't speak to people. Won't be civil. Glares at anyone who tries to make conversation. Some of the men say he is bitter and mean-natured now, and perhaps he is, I cannot say. But I think when a man loses everything in one season, something goes hard in him, like clay in a kiln, and there is not much to be done about it from the outside." She poured herself more coffee and looked at Ada with the mild, appraising eyes of a woman who had been watching people for a long time. "I just thought you should know, since you will be a part of this community, and it is better to know who is who before you stumble into something." "Thank you," Ada said, and she meant it plainly. She did not think much more about Clayton Carver that evening. She had her own concerns, her trunk to unpack, her room to make habitable, a set of reading primers to review before the school week began. She was practical by nature, and she had learned not to let worry run ahead of necessity. She met him for the first time 3 weeks after her arrival, and it happened by accident, the way most important things do. She had been at the general store run by a man named Hector Prout, picking up a length of chalk and 2 composition books she intended to use for the older students. The store was dim and smelled of tobacco and dried beans, and the particular dusty sweetness of bulk sugar stored in cloth sacks. She had been standing at the counter going through her purse for the correct coins when she heard the door open behind her and felt the shift in the quality of the air, a kind of deliberate stillness entering the room. Hector Prout's expression changed almost imperceptibly. His smile, which had been easy and chatty, became careful. Ada turned slightly, the way you do when something in the room demands to be acknowledged, and she saw him. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected. He wore a dark canvas coat despite the warmth of the day, and his hat was pulled low, casting the upper portion of his face in shadow. His jaw was set with a kind of permanent tension, like a man who had been clenching it for so long that the muscle had simply stayed that way. He was, she guessed, somewhere in his early 30s. There were lines at the corners of his eyes and a scar along his left jaw that was old and silver-white. He was not an ugly man. He was the sort of man who would have been considered handsome in a straightforward way before whatever had happened to him had happened, and whose features now carried a heaviness that sat over the bone structure like weather. He moved to the far end of the counter without looking at anyone and placed a folded list on the surface. Hector picked it up, read it, and began pulling items from the shelves without a word. There was no pleasantry exchanged, no greeting. Not even the minimal social currency of a nod. The silence between the storekeeper and the man named Clayton Carver was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who had reached an understanding. Ada finished counting out her coins, pushed them across the counter, and gathered her purchases. She was turning toward the door when the stack of composition books slipped from under her arm, and one of them skidded across the floorboards and came to rest directly beside the boot of Clayton Carver. He looked down at it. She looked at him. Neither of them moved for a moment, and Ada registered the particular quality of his stillness. It was not indifference. It was something more painful than that. It was the stillness of a man who had trained himself very carefully not to respond to anything. Ada crouched and picked up the composition book herself. It was not that she expected him to do it. She was simply matter-of-fact about it. She straightened up, tucked the books back under her arm, and looked at him. He was already looking away, his jaw set, his eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance to Hector's left shoulder. Ada said, "Thank you," and walked out. It was only outside, standing on the wooden sidewalk with the afternoon heat pressing down on her like a flat iron through cloth, that she realized what she had done. She had thanked him for nothing. He had not picked up the book. He had not moved or spoken or done a single thing to merit thanks. She had simply said the words out of a kind of reflexive politeness that she had not bothered to examine before she let it out. She stood there for a moment, slightly puzzled at herself, and then walked on down the street toward Mrs. Graber's. Inside the store, Clayton Carver stood with his fists pressed to the edge of the counter, and his heart doing something he could not quite account for. "Thank you." She had said it directly, not the flat, polite nothing that people sometimes flung in his direction like a stone thrown at a dog to make it move along. She had looked at him first. She had met his eyes, and then she had said it, and her voice had been entirely without guile, no performance in it, no anxious agreeableness, no fear. Just 2 plain syllables directed at him like she saw nothing particular in him to be afraid of. He did not know what to do with that. He had not known what to do with kindness for a very long time. He collected his supplies from Hector Prout, who maintained his careful silence with professional skill, and he loaded them into the bed of his wagon and drove the 8 miles back to the Double C without stopping and without looking back at the town. But the words sat with him the whole way, rattling around somewhere beneath his sternum like a coin in an empty tin, and he could not make them stop. He had not spoken a kind word to anyone in 5 years. Not to Hector Prout, not to the men who had once worked for him and had eventually drifted away when it became clear that the Double C was no longer what it had been. Not to his neighbor, old Ambrose Hatch, who had ridden over twice in the first year after a leaner died to see if Clayton needed anything, and had been met both times with a silence so complete and forbidding that he had eventually stopped coming. Not to the preacher who had said the words over Alina's grave on a gray November morning that smelled of cedar and cold iron. Not to anyone. He had not seen the point. He had built the Double C with his own hands, he and Alina together, in the summer of 1871, when they had come west from Missouri with a modest sum of money and an immoderate amount of conviction. They had worked the land through droughts and winters, had hired on 3 hands when the cattle herd grew large enough to require it, had built a proper frame house to replace the first soddy, had planted a kitchen garden and put up curtains in the windows that Alina had made from a bolt of blue calico that she had carried all the way from Missouri in a paper-wrapped parcel. They had been happy. He did not use that word lightly or loosely. He knew perfectly well that happiness was not a thing you noticed when you had it, and that you only understood what you had been holding when it was pulled from your hands. They had been happy. And then in the winter of 1873, their son Thomas had caught a fever that no amount of boiled water and cold compresses and prayer could break, and he had died on a Thursday morning while the snow was still falling. And Clayton had walked out of the house into the white field and stood there until Alina came and found him, and they had held each other up like 2 fence posts, leaning together against a wind that neither one of them could face alone. Alina had tried. He knew that. He knew that she had tried to keep going, to keep the light on inside herself, but something had gone out of her that day, and by the following autumn she was thinner than she should have been, and by the winter after that she was taking fevers of her own, and by the spring of 1874 she was buried beside Thomas on the low rise behind the house where she had liked to sit in the evenings and watch the light change over the mesa. After that, Clayton had simply stopped. Not all at once, not dramatically. He had not done anything in particular. He had kept the cattle. He had kept the land. He got up in the mornings and he did the work that needed doing because the cattle required it, and the fence required it, and the practical machinery of survival required it. And he had no particular desire to survive, but he had even less desire to make a decision about it one way or the other. So he simply continued, every day, moving through the necessary motions of a life, and he spoke to no one because there was no one to speak to. And he drove into Raydrock Crossing every few weeks for supplies, and he left as soon as he had them. And the years passed with the mechanical indifference of a clock that no one was watching. And then a woman with gray eyes had said thank you to him for nothing at all, and he could not get it out from under his ribs. He did not go back to town for 4 weeks after that. Longer than usual, which meant that when he did finally drive in, his supply list was longer and he had to spend more time in Prout's store than he liked. He had also run low on lamp oil, which meant stopping at the hardware store on the other side of the street. It was a Wednesday morning, and the school was letting out for the midday break when Clayton was loading the last of his supplies into the wagon bed. He heard the children before he saw them, the particular sound of children released from a confined space, that sudden eruption of voice and motion that seems to contain an entire season's worth of compressed energy. They came spilling out of the adobe building at the end of the block, 17 of them in various sizes, and scattered across the street like water thrown from a bucket. He watched them without meaning to. He had been reaching into the wagon bed to rearrange the sacks, and he had straightened up, and there they were. A boy of about 10 was chasing a smaller girl around the hitching post. 3 older girls were walking with their arms linked, talking with great earnestness. A pair of boys, his school-age younger ones, were crouching in the dust examining something, an insect, maybe, or a coin. And behind them, in the doorway of the school, stood Ada Holloway. She was watching the children with an expression that he recognized without being able to name exactly. It was the expression of someone who cared about something, who was genuinely and unself-consciously invested. She was leaning against the doorframe with a book held against her chest, and she was smiling at the boy who was chasing the girl around the hitching post, not because it was professionally appropriate to smile, but because she found it genuinely delightful. She looked up and saw him. He looked away first. He was not sure why. He had no reason to feel caught at anything. He was simply loading his wagon on a public street, but he felt something shift in his chest in an uncomfortable way, and he pulled his hat lower and climbed up onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. He did not drive away immediately. He told himself it was because a wagon had come around the corner and was occupying the middle of the street, and he needed to wait for it to pass. This was true. But it also gave him 30 seconds in which, despite his very best efforts, he glanced back in the direction of the school. Ada Holloway was still in the doorway. She was no longer looking at him. She was looking at the children again, and the book was open in her hands now, and she was reading something aloud to a small girl who had come back and was tugging on her sleeve. He could not hear what she was reading from this distance. He drove away. The trouble with the silence he had built around himself was that it had been, for 5 years, entirely adequate. It had kept everything out that needed to be kept out, and it had required very little maintenance. A hard face and a short word, and no eye contact was usually sufficient. People left him alone because he made it clear that being left alone was the only thing he wanted. He had not counted on someone who did not seem to notice the wall at all, or rather, who noticed it and looked through it with those gray eyes as though it were made of glass. He told himself this was nothing, a coincidence of proximity. She was a teacher who had arrived in town and he happened to have seen her twice. It meant precisely nothing. He told himself this for 2 more weeks, through a stretch of late spring weather that turned the Mesa country gold and pale green, through the work of repairing a section of fence line along the north pasture, through the long evenings sitting on the porch of the frame house watching the sky go dark over the mountains while the night creatures began their calling in the dry grass. He was doing the fence work alone, which he had done for years, when Ambrose Hatch rode over on a bay mare that was getting too old for hard riding. Ambrose was in his 60s now, a leather-faced man with a white mustache and the patient temperament of someone who had made his peace with the fact that the world was more difficult than it should be, and had decided to find it amusing rather than tragic. He had stopped riding over to check on Clayton years ago, after the second cold reception, but he occasionally came by on what he called practical pretexts, a borrowed tool, a question about water rights, a report on the condition of the shared fence line. Clayton suspected these were not practical pretexts at all, but he also had never worked out whether Ambrose understood that he understood this, and the whole arrangement had a quality of mutual pretense that was not entirely unpleasant. Ambrose pulled up the mare and looked at the section of fence Clayton was working on. "That post has been listing since winter," he said. "I thought about mentioning it." "You could have," Clayton said, which was more than he usually said to Ambrose. Ambrose registered this with a faint twitch of his white mustache. He settled back in the saddle and looked out over the pasture. "Town got a new schoolteacher," he said in the tone of someone mentioning the weather. Clayton drove a staple into the post with more force than was strictly necessary. "Name of Holloway," Ambrose continued, "came from Santa Fe. By all accounts she is doing well with the children. Prute's boy Caleb has apparently learned to read proper sentences, which his mother considered a minor miracle." He paused. "She seems like a steady sort." Clayton said nothing. "I am told she said good morning to you in the store last month and you walked past her like she was made of air." Clayton stopped working and looked at Ambrose. "I do not recall that." "No, I don't suppose you would." Ambrose tugged the brim of his hat. "I'm going to ride back over the property line now. You should know that fence is fine on my side for another 1/4 mile north." He turned the mare. "It would not kill you to speak to someone occasionally, Clayton. I believe that is still physiologically possible." He rode off before Clayton could respond, which Clayton suspected was deliberate. The thing was, he did not recall Ada Holloway saying good morning to him in the store. But he considered the possibility that he had been so thoroughly committed to his own invisibility that he had genuinely not heard it, and that thought made something shift uncomfortably in him, like a stone turning over in a river. He thought about that for longer than he should have. The following Saturday there was a social gathering at the church hall, a supper, organized by the ladies of the congregation as a fundraiser for the school, and it was the sort of thing that the town turned out for because Reed Rock Crossing was not a place with an excess of entertainment. Clayton had not attended a social gathering in 5 years. He had not intended to attend this one. He drove into town for supplies on Saturday morning with every intention of completing his purchases and driving directly home, as was his custom, as had been his custom for 5 years, as would continue to be his custom until he was dead. He completed his purchases. He loaded the wagon. He sat on the wagon seat with the reins in his hands. The church hall was at the far end of the main street. He could see lantern light through the windows, though it was still afternoon, and the lanterns were being lit early against the long desert dusk. He could hear, faintly, the sound of a fiddle being tuned. He had not eaten anything prepared by someone else's hands since a leaner died. He told himself that this was not a reason to go. He told himself that he was not going. He told himself this while his hands were apparently driving the wagon to the end of the street and tying it to the post outside the church hall. He stood outside for a long moment before going in. The hall was full but not crowded, perhaps 40 people, which was a significant portion of Reed Rock Crossing's modest population. There were tables with oilcloth covers and plates of food contributed by various households, and at the far end, a man named Creevy was working on a second tune with his fiddle. Children were running between the tables with the specific anarchic freedom of children at adult events. The air smelled of roasted meat and wood smoke, and the particular human warmth of a gathered community. Clayton stood inside the door and wanted, very badly, to leave. Several people noticed him and their expressions moved through the same sequence: surprise, uncertainty, a kind of cautious watchfulness, as though they were not sure what he was doing there, and were not sure it was going to be all right. One woman, whose name he could not remember, actually turned to say something to her neighbor behind her hand. He was about to leave. He had decided. He was going to turn around and walk out, and this whole thing could be set down as a moment of temporary insanity brought on by too many weeks of his own company, and he would never do it again. Then Ada Holloway came around the end of the nearest table with a plate in each hand and very nearly walked directly into him. She stopped. She looked up at him. There was no fear in her face and no social performance, no bright forced smile, no nervous laughter, no reaching for something to say. She simply looked at him for a moment, this woman with the gray eyes that saw straight through walls, and then she said, "I am glad you came." She meant it. He did not know how he knew that she meant it, but he did. It had the quality of something that was simply true, stated plainly, not offered as a pleasantry but as an actual fact of her experience. She was glad. She had no apparent reason to be glad, and yet she was, and she was not pretending otherwise. Clayton stood there and something inside him cracked, very slightly, very quietly, the way ice cracks in early spring, not breaking, not yet, but releasing a hairline of light. He did not know what to say. He had not known what to say to anyone for 5 years, but this was different from the usual absence of words. This was a different kind of not knowing. This was the not knowing of a man who had forgotten that words could be exchanged for something other than necessity. He said, "Thank you." His voice came out rougher than he expected, unused as it was for anything but the most minimal communications. Ada shifted the plates in her hands and nodded, and there was nothing in her expression that made him feel observed or studied or pitied. She simply nodded, the way you acknowledge something real, and then she said, "There is a seat at the end of that table if you want one." And she carried the plates to their destination and left him standing there without making a production of any of it. He sat down at the table. He did not speak to anyone for the duration of the supper, but he sat there, and he ate food that other people had made, and the fiddle played, and the children ran between the tables. And for the first time in 5 years, Clayton Carver sat inside a human gathering and did not feel entirely like he was watching it through a pane of glass from the outside. Ada was busy for most of the supper. She was, he gathered, one of the organizers, and she moved between tables refilling cups and carrying dishes, and talking easily to the various townspeople with a manner that was warm without being performed. He watched her without particularly meaning to. She spoke to everyone with the same quality of attention, not more for the important people, not less for the awkward ones. She spent a full 5 minutes talking to a young woman who sat alone at the corner of a table with the particular stillness of someone who was very shy, and when she left that corner, the young woman was smiling. He rode home in the dark, and the stars over the New Mexico territory were so thick and low that they seemed almost companionable, which was a thought he had not had about anything in a very long time. He came back to town the following Wednesday. This was not his usual schedule. He had no practical reason to come to town on a Wednesday. His supply list from Saturday had been adequately filled, and he had nothing to collect from the hardware store or the post office. He drove the 8 miles on the wagon road anyway, and told himself that the main axle had been making a sound that might need Gideon Ware's attention at the smithy, which was true enough to serve as a pretext even if it was not the primary reason. He left the wagon at the smithy and walked down the main street, and as he passed the school, he could hear her voice through the single open window, not the words, just the quality of it, reading something to the children in that steady, unhurried way she had, giving each sentence room to breathe. He stood on the sidewalk outside the smithy for a while, under the pretext of looking at something interesting in the window of the land agent's office next door, which had nothing interesting in it whatsoever. He had not stood still in a public place for 5 years. He had not lingered. He was always moving through town on a direct line from arrival to departure, creating as little friction with the town as possible. He stood there for 20 minutes. When the school let out at the midday break, he was still there, and this time he did not look away when Ada Holloway came to the door. She saw him immediately. She seemed to have a peripheral awareness of him that he was not sure what to make of, and after she had seen the older children off and directed a younger boy back toward the direction of home, she walked across the street. She was wearing a white blouse with a small collar and a brown skirt that had been carefully mended at the hem, and her hair was slightly less tidy than it had been at the supper, because it was the end of a school morning and she had been working. She looked real. She looked like a person who did actual work in the actual world, and this was something he found, he realized, deeply appealing. The axle, he said, which was not what he had meant to say, but it was the first thing his brain produced that was connected to a complete sentence. Ada looked at the wagon which was propped up beside the smithy. Is it serious? Gideon says it will need a new pin, probably an hour's work. Then you have time, she said, not in a particular way, just noting a fact. She looked at him for a moment. Have you eaten today? He had not, as it happened. He had left the Double C early and had not thought about it. No, he said. Mrs. Graber usually puts out food at noon for the boarders. She always makes too much and she does not like waste. Ada paused. I board there. I could bring you something or you could come in. He was about to say no. The word was right there. It was the word he always said, the word that required nothing further. But Ada was already half turned back toward the boarding house, not pressing him, not performing casualness, just leaving the door open and walking toward it herself, and he found his feet following her before he had consciously directed them to. Mrs. Graber received him with extraordinary composure for a woman who had told Ada 3 weeks earlier that Clayton Carver had not set foot in any private dwelling in Reed Rock Crossing since his wife had died. She simply put another plate on the table and poured another cup of coffee, and went back to the kitchen with the satisfied air of a woman whose arrangements had always, in the end, worked out. Ada ate her food and talked to him without requiring that he talk back in equal measure, which was a skill he had not previously considered, but which he now recognized as a genuine one. She talked about the children with the peculiar love and exasperation of a teacher, the way she described the boy who was very fast at arithmetic but could not be made to sit still long enough to copy a sentence, the girl who could read anything put in front of her but could not grasp the concept of carrying an addition. She talked about the school building, which needed a new window and had a crack in the back wall that she had flagged for the town council without result. He listened. He ate. Twice he said something, once to answer a direct question about whether he had gone to school himself, and once because she had described something about the behavior of one of the older boys that was clearly going to cause trouble if it continued, and he said, without thinking, "That boy needs work, not punishment. Work. Something that uses his hands and requires actual effort." He said it before he remembered that he was not supposed to be contributing to conversations. Ada looked at him with those gray eyes. "That is probably the most useful piece of advice anyone has given me about him," she said simply. He had no idea what to do with that. He went back to the Double C that afternoon with a new axle pin and a sense of mild disorientation that he could not shake for the rest of the week. He found himself doing things he had not done in years, not dramatic things, but small ones. He looked at the house and noticed that the porch step had rotted through on the left side and needed replacing. He had noticed this in the abstract sense for over a year, but now he found himself going to the woodpile and selecting a plank and measuring it. He replaced the step. It took about an hour. When he finished, he stood back and looked at it, and the house looked, fractionally, less like a place where time had stopped. He came back to town the following Saturday, which was his regular day, and he stopped at Prute's store and got his supplies, and when he was done, he crossed the street to the boarding house and knocked on the door. Mrs. Graber answered. "Is Miss Holloway available?" he said, and the words felt so formal and strange in his mouth that he almost regretted them before Mrs. Graber's face had fully opened into its delighted expression. Ada came to the door in her good dress, not the work clothes of the school week, but a dress of deep blue wool that made her gray eyes look almost dark. She looked at him with an expression of calm interest, as though men she had spoken to twice came to her door regularly, and it was entirely unremarkable. "I thought," he said, and then stopped, because he had prepared approximately this far and no further. "I thought if you were not occupied, you might want to walk." He said it the way you say something you are not entirely confident will survive the air outside your head. Ada considered this for a moment. Then she stepped back into the hall, took a light shawl from the hook by the door, and came out onto the porch. "I am not occupied," she said. They walked down the main street, and at the far end turned onto the road that led toward the open country at the edge of town. The late afternoon was all clear gold light, and the smell of sage, and the distant sound of cattle somewhere in the middle distance. They walked without particular urgency, and for a while they said very little, but the silence had a different quality from the silence he usually kept. It was not absence, it was more like the space between words in a sentence, which is itself a kind of structure. He asked her eventually where she was from. "Texas, originally," she said. "A small town near Abilene. My father was a schoolteacher as well. My mother ran a laundry." She glanced sideways at him. "You, Missouri," he said. "We came west in '71. She let the "we" sit there without pressing it, which was another thing he noticed about her. She understood which words had weight and did not step on them carelessly. After a moment she said, "Do you like it here? New Mexico?" He thought about this honestly rather than reflexively. He looked out at the mesa country, at the reddish-brown earth and the scattered juniper, and the way the mountains sat on the horizon in that particular blue haze of late spring. He had not thought about whether he liked anything in a very long time. "I think I forgot to notice," he said at last. Ada nodded. "That happens." They walked a little further. A red-tailed hawk passed low over the open ground to their left, banking in a smooth arc and rising on a thermal without any visible effort. They both watched it until it was high and small above the mesa. "I was engaged once," Ada said, without particular preface. "In Santa Fe. A man named Robert Deering who ran a freighting company. I thought I was quite sensibly in love with him." She paused. "He was sensible. I was sensible." It was a thoroughly sensible arrangement, and it had about as much warmth in it as a business contract, which I think is what it actually was. I ended it and he was not very surprised, which told me what I needed to know about whether it had been love. Clayton was quiet for a moment. "Are you telling me this for a reason?" She looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was very nearly amusement, but softer than that. "I am telling you this because I think you have spent a long time being very careful about what you share, and I have decided that I should share some things without being asked, to make it a little less one-sided." He thought about this for a long time as they walked. He said, "My wife's name was Alina." Ada did not say she was sorry, which he appreciated. He had been told he was sorry for so many years that the phrase had become a kind of blunt instrument, something people used not to communicate grief but to discharge their own discomfort with it. She simply turned her face toward him and listened. She was the kind of person who made things better by being in them, he said. Not by doing anything in particular, just by being there. The room was different when she was in it. He had not said Alina's name aloud in at least 2 years. It felt like lifting a stone you were not sure you could lift and discovering that you could. "We lost our son first, Thomas. He was 3. He stopped walking. Ada stopped beside him. After that she tried to keep going. She was better at it than I was. And then she was gone too, and I did not." He stopped again. The words were there, but they were in a tangle like wire that has been left too long in a pile. "I did not know how to be a person any more without her, and I thought the most honest thing I could do was to stop pretending." "Stop pretending to be fine," Ada said quietly. "Stop pretending to be anything." The hawk had disappeared into the white of the sky, and the sage stretched out in every direction, silver green in the fading light. "I think that made sense," Ada said. "At the time." He looked at her. "But I do not think it still does," she said, and she said it gently, without judgment, without the air of someone who was trying to fix him or instruct him. She said it the way you state a fact about a landscape that has changed, not criticism, just observation. He stood there for a long time. Then he said, "No, I don't think it does either." They walked back to town in the last of the evening light, and when they reached the boarding house he said good night and she said good night, and she went inside, and he drove home through the night with the stars above and the sage smell in the air. And he tested this word carefully, like a man pressing down on ice before committing his weight, something approaching alive. The weeks that followed were the closest thing to ordinary that Clayton had known in 5 years. And ordinary, he was discovering, was an underrated condition. He came to town on Saturdays, which was his regular day, and sometimes on Wednesdays, which was not, and he did not pretend that the Wednesdays were about the wagon or the axle or any other mechanical pretext. He came because Ada was there, and he was beginning to be able to admit this to himself. They fell into a rhythm that suited both of them. He would stop at Prute's store, and then he would find her, and they would walk or sit on the porch of the boarding house, or, on cooler evenings, in the small sitting room that Mrs. Graber made available with tactful regularity. He talked more than he had talked in years, and it was strange. He had imagined, in the way you imagine things you have not done in so long that they seem theoretical, that talking would feel like bleeding. Instead, it felt more like being a window that had been painted shut for a long time, and someone had begun carefully, without force, to work the seal loose. He told her about the double C, about the way it had been in the good years, about the kitchen garden that Alina had planted and that he had let go to seed and then to nothing, about the blue calico curtains that were still in the bedroom because he had never been able to take them down and had never been able to look at them directly either, about Thomas, who had been a solemn baby, and then a very talkative small boy who had gone through a period of asking why about literally everything with an intensity that had been exhausting and magnificent. Ada listened to all of it without flinching. She listened the way she read to her children steadily, giving each thing its full weight. In return, she told him about her father, who had died of a lung complaint when she was 19 and left the family in a difficult position, and about the years of careful scraping together that had followed, and about the way she had found, in the teaching, something that was not consolation exactly but was close to it. The particular satisfaction of watching a child cross the threshold from not knowing to knowing, which she said was the best thing she had ever seen happen repeatedly. He began, without entirely meaning to laugh again. Not often, and not with the easy fluency of a man for whom laughter came naturally, but occasionally, at something Ada said that was quietly and precisely funny, because she had a dry wit that operated below the surface of her steady manner, and revealed itself in the way you come across a spring in dry country, unexpectedly, and with disproportionate delight. He noticed things on the ride home that he had not noticed in years. The way the road curved through the juniper stand and came out suddenly onto the open plateau. The particular color of the sky at the hour before dark, not the dramatic orange and red of full sunset, but the first fading, that soft lilac above the western mountains. The smell of the creosote after rain. He had been riding this road for 7 years and had, for the last 5 of them, been looking at it without seeing it. One Saturday in July, he asked her if she wanted to come out to the Double C. He said it simply, standing in front of Prute's store with his supply sacks already loaded, and he said it the way he had learned slowly to say most things to Ada directly, without too much preamble, because she responded better to directness than to oblique approach, and because, he had found, directness was less exhausting than its alternatives. Ada looked at him for a moment. The question had weight, and they both knew it. He had not brought anyone to the Double C in 5 years. He had not wanted anyone there in the space where his life had been. "I would like that," she said. She rode up beside him on the wagon bench, which she had never done before, and they drove out of town on the wagon road with the July heat pressing down on the mesa country from a white and merciless sky. She had a book in her lap that she had brought along to school that morning, and she held it without opening it and watched the country go past, and once she pointed at something in the distance, a herd of pronghorn moving east across a dry wash, and he stopped the wagon and they watched until the herd had passed behind a low ridge and was gone. When the Double C came into view, he watched her face. She was not performing a reaction. She was simply looking, registering the house and the outbuildings and the cattle grazing in the south pasture, and the low rise behind the house where the 2 graves sat under a pair of twisted juniper trees that he had planted the spring after Eleanor died. She did not say it was lovely, or it was a shame, or anything that would have required him to perform a response. She got down from the wagon and walked toward the house with the same matter-of-fact quality she brought to everything, and she waited at the porch step while he saw to the horse. He showed her the house. This was more difficult than the walk or the conversation, because the house was a physical record of everything that had happened here and everything that had been done and not done since. The kitchen was functional and clean in the way that a man's kitchen is clean when he has kept it only for himself. No warmth in it, no small objects on the windowsill, no herbs hanging from the ceiling. The front room had a chair and a table and a lamp and nothing else that was not purely utilitarian. The bedroom had the blue calico curtains, faded now and slightly stiff, but still there. Ada stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment, not going in. "She made those," Clayton said from behind her. "They are beautiful," Ada said, and her voice was just slightly softer than usual, as though she had turned it down out of respect for the room. He stood there and felt for the first time that the curtains were not only sad. They were evidence that Eleanor had existed and had made things beautiful and had put them up in a window to let the light through. They were, he thought, something to be honored rather than avoided. He said, without having planned to say it, "I was going to take them down after she died. I could not, and then I think I thought that made me weak, but I think maybe they should stay." Ada turned and looked at him. "Yes," she said simply. "I think they should." They sat on the porch in the late afternoon, and he made coffee, which was the only food he could produce that involved any real skill. And Ada drank it without complaint, even though it was the strong, dark cowboy coffee of a man who had been making it for himself alone for years, and had long since ceased to calibrate it for anyone else's tolerance. She looked out at the south pasture and asked him practical questions about the cattle operation, how many head he was running, what the water situation was, whether the summer had been kind on the grass, and he answered them in the straightforward way you answer someone who is actually interested and not just making conversation. Before she left, she walked up to the low rise. He had not suggested this. He had not followed her immediately. He had watched from the porch as she walked through the dry grass toward the 2 juniper trees, and then he had followed at a distance, not because he was reluctant, but because there was something right about giving her a moment to approach it on her own terms. The graves were simple 2 crosses he had made from cedar wood and set deep in the rocky ground, and 2 flat stones on which he had cut the names with a hand chisel, slowly and carefully, in the first terrible weeks. Thomas Clayton Carver, 1870 to 1873. Eleanor Me Carver, 1847 to 1874. Ada stood between them for a long moment with the evening wind moving in the juniper branches and the light going golden across the mesa. Then she said, very quietly, "Thank you for letting me come here." He stood beside her and looked at the names he had cut in the stone himself, the names he had been unable to speak aloud for years, and he felt something in him that was not grief exactly, or not only grief, something that was grief and love together, the way those things actually are when you are being honest about them, inseparable and both real. "Thomas liked the view from up here," he said. "He used to make me carry him up. He would stand right there and point at the mountains and say something very serious about them that I could never entirely make out." Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she made a small, soft sound that was almost like a laugh, but it was the kind of laugh that is full of sorrow and full of love in equal measure, and it was exactly the right thing. He drove her back to town as the night came on, and the stars appeared in their thousands above the mesa country, and he was not the man he had been that morning, or rather, he was more of the man he had been, which was a different thing. The summer moved through its fierce weeks and into the cooler turn of early September, and Clayton Carver was, by any measure observable from outside, a changed man, though he would not have used those words himself. He would have said that certain things had been recovered, which were different from being changed. He spoke to Hector Prout when he came in for supplies, which required some adjustment on Hector's part, as he had grown so accustomed to the wordless exchange that actual conversation made him slightly uncertain for a few weeks until he settled into it. He exchanged 2 full sentences with Ambrose Hatch about a property boundary question, and Ambrose, to his considerable credit, received this escalation in communication with the practiced ease of a man who had been waiting for it for years and had no intention of making a scene about it. He hired a young man named Eli Breckenridge to help with the fall work at the Double C. Eli was 20 years old and had come to New Mexico from Texas looking for work, and he had a steady manner and a willingness to learn that Clayton found he could respect. He did not talk too much, and he did not ask questions about the graves on the rise, and he was good with the cattle and better with the horses, and having him there changed the character of the place, not dramatically, but in the way that a single lit lamp changes a dark room. One Saturday in late September, after they had walked out along the creek road east of town and come back in the cool of the afternoon, and sat on the boarding house porch with cups of cider that Mrs. Graber had brought out uninvited, and then retreated to give them privacy, Clayton said to Ada, without particular ceremony, "I think I am in love with you." He said it the way he had learned to say important things directly, because anything less would have been a disrespect to both of them. He said it, and then he sat there, holding his cup of cider, and waited. Ada looked at him. She had a quality, he had learned, of not responding to important things immediately, not because she was unsure but because she was giving the thing its full weight. She looked at him for long enough that a man less certain of her character would have been anxious. But he had come to understand that her pauses were a form of respect rather than a form of hesitation. "I think I have been in love with you for about 2 months," she said, "and I have been waiting for you to say that for a considerable portion of it." He laughed. A real laugh, not the cautious fractional thing of the early weeks. A full laugh, surprised out of him, and Ada looked at him with an expression that was the warmest thing he had seen directed at him in 5 years. A kind of genuine delight, and under it something deep and steady that was, he was almost certain, the same thing he was feeling and had not been sure until this moment was still possible to feel. He set down his cider cup and reached over and took her hand, and she did not pull it back, and they sat there on the porch in the September afternoon with the sound of the street traffic below and the smell of autumn coming on and the whole of the future sitting between them, large and uncharted, and for the first time in a very long time, genuinely promising. He proposed to her on a Tuesday in October. He had thought about doing it with ceremony, had, in fact, considered it in a practical and unromantic way for about a week, noting that he should choose a good occasion and a good setting. But it happened the way the best things happened with Ada, which was unrehearsed and honest. They were at the Double C. She had come out several more times since the first visit, and she had begun, with a naturalness that moved him, to treat the kitchen as a space that could be improved, bringing a blue enamel pot from Mrs. Graber, who had a spare and did not want it going to waste, pointing out a crack in the smoke vent that she said she knew how to repair with adobe plaster, and then actually repairing it while he stood by watching with a mixture of gratitude and the mildly humbled feeling of a man who has discovered that the woman he loves is more practically capable than he is at any given thing. They were sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them. She had brought a book, and he had been going through the ranch accounts, which he had maintained in a functional if joyless way for 5 years, and he looked up, and she was reading with the complete absorption she brought to books, her chin resting in her hand, and the lamplight was on her face, and the blue curtains were visible through the doorway to the bedroom, and something in the conjunction of all of it made the words simply come out. "Ada," he said. She looked up. "I want you to stay." She looked at him with great steadiness. "Stay how?" she said, not as a question exactly, but as an invitation to be more specific. "Marry me," he said. "I want you to be here. I want the Double C to be yours and mine. I want—" He paused and said the next thing carefully because it was the truest thing and needed to be said without flinching. "I want a life again, and I want it with you." Ada set her book down very deliberately on the table, face down to keep her place, the way a person does when they are giving their full attention to something and do not intend to be long about it. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Clayton Carver." He got up from the table and went around it, and she stood up to meet him, and he held her, just held her, her face against his chest and his arms around her, and neither of them said anything for a long while, and the lamp burned steadily between the ranch accounts and the open book, and outside the night was full of stars and the smell of sage. They were married in November of 1878 in the Redrock Crossing Church, in a ceremony that was small and without unnecessary spectacle. Ada wore her blue dress and carried a small bunch of dried flowers that Mrs. Graber had put together from her garden. Clayton wore a white shirt that Eli Breckenridge had pointed out, with some embarrassment, still had its original store crease because it had never been worn. He had ironed it himself with a heated pan that morning, imperfectly but sincerely. The preacher was a man named Aldridge who had heard rumors of Clayton Carver's altered temperament and received confirmation of it in the form of the man standing at the altar looking at the woman walking toward him with an expression that was, frankly, eloquent. Ambrose Hatch attended and sat in the second pew with his white mustache perfectly arranged, and his eyes somewhat brighter than usual, though he would have dismissed this as the dust if anyone had mentioned it. Mrs. Graber sat beside him, and did not dismiss the brightness of her own eyes at all. Hector Prout came and brought his wife, and Eli Breckenridge came and stood at the back in his good coat looking young and serious and very genuinely pleased. Ada and Clayton exchanged their vows in the plain language of the 1878 frontier ceremony, which was uncomplicated but not without weight, and when the preacher said that Clayton might kiss his bride, he did so, briefly and with great care, and Ada put her hand against the side of his face in a gesture that was so quietly tender that Mrs. Graber had to press her handkerchief to her mouth. Afterward there was food in the church hall and Creevy played his fiddle, and some of the people danced, and Clayton Carver, who had not danced since the summer of 1872 at a barn social on a neighboring property, stood up with his wife on the swept plank floor, and danced with her in the imprecise and unpracticed way of a man who has forgotten more than he knows but is trying honestly. And Ada danced with him in the patient and quietly laughing way of a woman who is having exactly the evening she wanted. That night they drove back to the Double C together, Ada beside him on the wagon bench, the stars over New Mexico immense and cold and very bright, the Mesa country silver with moonlight. She had her hand through his arm and her head was on his shoulder, and he drove with the reins loose in one hand and his other arm around her, and the horse knew the road well enough by now to require very little guidance. The house, when they came to it, was lit. Eli had come ahead and put the lamps on and had left a note on the kitchen table that said, in his careful handwriting, "Congratulations to you both," and had left what appeared to be a fresh-baked pie on the windowsill, which meant that someone Mrs. Graber most likely, with Eli as accomplice, had arranged things in the kind and conspiratorial way of people who care about an outcome. Ada laughed when she saw the pie. She laughed with her whole face, and the sound of it filled the kitchen, and Clayton stood there watching her laugh and felt the house change. Not in any dramatic way. The blue calico curtains were still in the bedroom, and the cedar crosses were still on the rise behind the house, and Thomas and Alina were still gone in the way that people who are loved never entirely go. But the house was no longer a place where time had stopped. It was a place where time was moving again, and he was in it, and Ada was in it, and the lamp was lit and there was pie. The months that followed were a season of recovery in the way that spring is a season of recovery, not forgetting the winter but building upward through it. Ada arranged things in the house with the practical ease of a woman who had her own clear sense of what a home required, not imposing a foreign order but extending what was already there. She put a pot of desert sage on the kitchen windowsill, and it flowered in December. She brought her books, which were numerous by the standards of the frontier, and which required 2 new shelves that Clayton built from planks and set against the front room wall. She kept her position at the school, which was what she wanted and which he supported without reservation, driving her in on weekday mornings when the weather was bad and seeing to it that the wagon was serviceable and the horse was ready. He talked more. Not constantly, not with the voluble ease of people for whom words come fluently, but steadily, in the way that a man who had been a stone in a river gradually becomes a part of the current still recognizably himself, still substantial but moving. He talked to Ada and to Eli and to Ambrose Hatch, with whom he had struck up an actual friendship by the spring, the kind of friendship between older and younger men that is mostly companionable silence and occasional blunt exchanges about cattle and weather, but which contains, beneath that, a genuine mutual regard. He was less hard. He was not sure if that was the right way to put it. He had not been mean, exactly, in his silence, but he had been unapproachable in a way that had its own kind of harm, a man-shaped vacancy in the community that had forced those around him to move around the absence. He was filling back in now. He was becoming a person who existed in relation to other people, and it was less frightening than he had expected. In the spring of 1879, Ada told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning before he went out to work. She told him directly, looking at him with those steady gray eyes, and for a moment he was very still. He had had a child before. He had loved his child before. He knew what it was to lose a child, and he carried that knowledge in the way you carry a scar. It was permanent. It had changed the shape of things, and it would never not be there. He felt the fear of it very specifically, in a way that he could not pretend was abstract. Ada was looking at him, and she knew what he was feeling. She had come to know his silences in their different textures, and this one she understood without being told. She said, "I'm afraid too." He looked at her. "I know what you're thinking about," she said, "and I think those things too, and I believe we will be all right, but I cannot promise you certainty because I do not have it. What I have is this. You and I will face whatever comes together, and we will not face it alone, and I believe that matters." He had not cried since Alina's funeral. He had not, in 5 years of silence and grief, produced a single tear, not because he was without feeling, but because the grief had been so enormous and so total that it had gone beyond the machinery of tears, had become simply the weather of his interior life, constant and colorless and there. Now, standing in his kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the desert sage blooming in its pot and Ada's hands holding his eyes filled, and 2 tears ran down the face that had been a hard face for so long, and he did not turn away. Ada put her arms around him and held him the way she had held him on their wedding night, steadily, without performance, just present and true. "We will be all right," she said again, not as a promise but as an intention, as something to move toward together. They were. The pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated, which was not something to take for granted on the frontier in 1879. But Ada was strong and Mrs. Graber was experienced, and there was a good doctor in a town called Myra, 30 miles to the west, who came out when Ada's time came in late November. It was a long labor, nearly 18 hours, and Clayton sat outside the bedroom door through most of it doing nothing useful, and being fully aware that there was nothing useful to be done, which was a particular kind of difficulty. The baby was born at 4 in the morning on a cold November night that smelled of wood smoke and winter coming, and the doctor came to the door and said that Ada was well and the baby was well, and it was a boy. Clayton went in, and Ada was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were open and clear, and she was holding the baby against her chest, and she looked up at him when he came through the door, and she said, "Come and see." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, small and red-faced and profoundly new, with Ada's brow and what might become, in time, his own jaw. He was breathing steadily in the shallow, rapid way of newborns, making small sounds of adjustment to the world. Clayton's hand was very large against the baby's back. Ada watched him. "What would you like to name him?" He thought about it for a moment, and then he said, "James. James Thomas Carver." He used Thomas for the middle name not as an erasure of grief, but as a continuation of love, a thread carried forward rather than a door closed. And Ada understood this, and her eyes filled, and she did not cry, just nodded. "James Thomas Carver," she said softly. "Hello, James." James was, from the very beginning, an extraordinarily opinionated individual. He was loud when he was hungry and loud when he was not, and he had opinions about temperature and position, and the speed at which Ada moved from one room to another, and he made these opinions known with an energy that suggested a personality of considerable force. Clayton held him every morning while Ada slept the extra hour she had earned, and walked him around the kitchen talking to him in a low voice about whatever was on his mind. The fence repairs needed, the state of the south pasture, the behavior of the horses, and James would look at him with the focused intensity of an infant who is taking in everything and storing it for future use. Ada went back to the school in the new year, which the town of Raydrock Crossing received with universal relief, as the substitute arrangement had been managed by the wife of the land agent who was pleasant but had no gift for it. James went with her 2 days a week in a basket, which the children regarded with the particular solemn interest of people who have encountered something genuinely remarkable. On the other days, Eli Breckenridge's sister, a capable 17-year-old girl named Ruth who had come to stay with her brother the previous fall, looked after James at the Double C, and James received this arrangement with a tolerance suggesting that he understood the situation was reasonable. The Double C began, that year, to become again what it had been. Not exactly what it had been, nothing returns exactly, but something of its own kind of flourishing. Clayton and Eli expanded the herd through a careful purchase of 20 additional head from a rancher to the south who was moving on. The fence line was fully repaired. The garden behind the house was replanted in the spring, Ada's doing, though she consulted Clayton on each plant, and he found that he had more opinions about a kitchen garden than he had expected to discover in himself. The blue calico curtain stayed in the bedroom window. They had been joined by a new curtain in the kitchen, plain cotton that Ada had made from a bolt of fabric she had brought from town, and the house had the quality of a place that was being lived in at full volume again. On a warm evening in June of 1880, Clayton and Ada sat on the porch of the Double C as the light went golden over the mesa. James, now 7 months old and recently possessed of a determination to sit up independently, was in Ada's lap making his case for this developmental goal with great physical conviction. Eli had ridden out for the evening to visit a young woman in town whose name he had been mentioning with increasing frequency, and the Double C was quiet around them in the particular way that it was quiet in the evenings, full of the sounds of cattle and wind and the distant call of birds, but not empty. Clayton had been quiet for a while. Ada knew his silences well enough by now to know the difference between the ones that needed space and the ones that were working up to something. "I have been thinking," he said eventually. "I know," she said. He looked at her sideways. She smiled. "You get a particular look." He allowed this. "I have been thinking about the school. It needs a proper building. The adobe one is too small and that crack in the back wall is worse than it was." Ada looked at him. "I know. The town council has tabled it twice." "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that it should not wait for the town council. I was thinking that if I spent some time this fall before the hard work, and if Eli can spare some hours, and if Ambrose Hatch, who owes me a favor regarding that disputed fence line from last March, can be persuaded to contribute his labor," he paused. "I was thinking I could build it." Ada was very still for a moment. "You would build the school," she said. "It is a practical matter," he said. "There are more children now than there were when you arrived. There will be more. The building needs to be larger. These are facts." Ada looked at him with an expression he had come to know as particular and distinct from her others. Not the steady listening expression, not the dry-humored one, not the tender one from their private hours. This was the expression of a woman who was looking at a man and seeing the full distance he had traveled and being moved by it in a way that she was not going to reduce to words because no words were quite adequate. "These are facts," she agreed, her voice slightly quieter than usual. "So that is what I intend to do," he said, and he said it with the businesslike manner of a man announcing a practical decision. But his jaw had the faintest possible softening that meant he was not quite as businesslike as he was presenting. She shifted James to one arm and put her free hand over his, and they sat there on the porch of the Double C in the June evening, while the mesa turned pink, and the cattle moved slowly in the south pasture, and James made his views on sitting upright known with patient conviction. He built the school that fall, as he had said he would, with Eli and Ambrose and a carpenter from Myra named Dan Byers who came out for a week and brought 2 of his sons. It took 4 weeks from foundation to roof, through October's variable weather, cold mornings and warm afternoons, and one rain that delayed them 2 days. The new building was twice the size of the old adobe, with real windows on both sides, 2 doors, proper floors, and a wood stove that would not, as Ada had been managing for 2 years, produce smoke in the room at any wind above 12 miles per hour. When it was done, Ada walked through it with Clayton, running her hand along the edge of the windowsills, looking at the floors, examining the wood stove with a professional eye. The children had not come yet. It was a Saturday and the building was fresh and empty and full of the smell of new wood and clean plaster. She stood in the middle of the room and looked up at him, and he was leaning against the door frame and the light came through the new windows in long, bright diagonals. "Clayton," she said. "Yes. This is the kindest thing anyone has done for this town in a very long time." He was quiet for a moment. She said it again, very simply. "This is a kind thing you have done." He looked at her in the new light, in the room he had built for her, for the children, for the life they were making, and he thought about the man he had been 5 years ago, and 6 years ago, and the years before that, and all the roads between them. The grief road and the silence road and the road that led from a woman's unremarkable thank you in a general store to this moment in a sunlit room. He pushed off from the doorframe and crossed the room and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him, and he said into her hair, "You said something kind to me once and I did not know what to do with it." She was still for a moment. Then she said, "I know." I had not been spoken to like that in so long that I did not have a place for it. I did not know what to do with it. "And now?" she asked in the quiet voice. He held her a little closer. "Now I know," he said. They stood there in the new school building, while the October light moved through the windows, and James, with Eli currently in charge of him back at the Double C, was presumably continuing his developmental campaign. And the Mesa country stretched in every direction outside, the same Mesa country that had watched 5 years of silence and was now watching something else entirely. The school opened the following Monday with 21 children, which was 4 more than had attended the old building. Ada welcomed them through the new door with the same steady attention she had always given them, equal, warm, and entirely genuine. And she read to them from the primer in her particular voice that gave each word its full weight, and the new wood stove worked perfectly, and the light came in through both sides of the room, and the year moved forward. By the winter of 1881, Ada was expecting their second child. She told Clayton in the same direct way she had told him about James, in the kitchen in the morning, with her eyes clear and her chin level, and this time, while the echo of old fear was still present in him, it was quieter. It did not silence him. He pulled her into his arms immediately, and she laughed at the vehemence of it. This time the labor was shorter, though not without difficulty, and the doctor from Myra came again, and in early March a daughter arrived smaller than James had been, with a serious face and Ada's dark hair, and a remarkable capacity from the first hours for making her requirements known with great precision. "Emma Eleanor Carver," Ada said when Clayton asked, looking at him carefully. He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor," his wife's name offered carefully by the woman who now bore his name. "You do not have to," he said. "I know I do not have to," she said simply. "I want to. She should be remembered in this house." He looked at his daughter, at the serious small face, at Ada's dark hair already present in the fine wisps across the baby's head. "Emma Eleanor," he said. "Hello, Emma," Ada said softly. James, who was 15 months old and had recently expanded his worldview to include walking and a particular attachment to a wooden spoon, regarded his sister with the expression of someone confronting a complex situation and reserving judgment. He came around eventually, with the natural ease of a child who was secure enough in his own situation to be generous, and by the summer he had appointed himself Emma's chief observer and occasional protector, standing between her and any perceived threat, including, on one occasion, Ambrose Hatch's bay mare, who had done nothing threatening whatsoever. The years moved. Clayton was no longer the man who had driven in silence through Reed Rock Crossing and been met with the particular dread usually reserved for rattlesnakes and dry lightning. He was, instead, a man who was known, not loudly, not extravagantly, but genuinely. People knew him as the rancher at the Double C who had built the school and whose wife was the teacher, and whose children could be seen in town on Saturdays, with a self-possession that suggested they had been raised by people who expected them to be capable. He was not a man who sought company for its own sake, that had not changed, was not likely to change, was part of the fundamental structure of him. But he was no longer armored. He was no longer sealed. He had, on an occasion or two, said kind things to people without being asked to, which Ambrose Hatch received with visible satisfaction and no comment, because Ambrose Hatch was a man who understood that the correct response to a victory was dignity. On a Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1882, Clayton rode up to the rise behind the house alone, which he did sometimes on horseback, when he needed the particular quality of that place. He dismounted and stood between the two cedar crosses with the wind moving through the juniper branches overhead, and the mesa country spread out in every direction in its autumn colors, the dried grasses golden and the juniper dark, and the mountains far to the north, already carrying a faint suggestion of early snow. He had been coming here for years. In the first years he had come here out of a kind of compulsion, the way you touch a wound to verify that it is still there. He came less often now, and with a different quality of approach, not compulsion but intention. He stood there for a while and thought about Thomas, who would have been 12 years old this year, who had been solemn and then talkative, and who had had strong opinions about the mountains visible from this rise. He thought about Alina, who had made the blue calico curtains and planted the first kitchen garden, and who had loved him with a fidelity that he had not deserved to keep at the end, because he had gone so far into himself that she could not reach him, and he had to live with the knowledge that she had died in a house where he had stopped speaking. He had not said a kind word to anyone for 5 years after that. He had been carrying it that long. He thought about Ada in the school below, with James now starting to read and Emma pulling herself up against the furniture, with the focused determination of a child who had decided that walking was a thing that was going to happen soon whether the world was ready for it or not. He thought about the particular accident of kindness, 2 syllables, freely given for nothing, for a book picked up off the floor, for a man who had done nothing to earn them and had not known what to do with them, and had turned them over in the space beneath his sternum for weeks before he understood that they were not a mystery but an invitation. He said, not aloud but not only to himself, that he was doing well. He said it to Thomas and to Alina in the way you speak to the people you have lost and loved, not expecting a response but maintaining the conversation that does not end simply because one of the parties is gone. He thought Alina would have liked Ada. He thought this with some regularity, and he thought it with the particular grief and gratitude of a man who understands that it is possible to love 2 people, and that neither love cancels the other. He rode back down to the house in the late afternoon, and Ada came to the door when she heard the horse, because she always came to the door, and she looked at him with the steady gray eyes that could see straight through walls, and she did not ask him where he had been because she knew. She stepped back and let him in, and James was at the kitchen table with a book open, and Emma was asleep in the front room in the old wooden cradle that Eli had sanded down and repaired, and the kitchen smelled of supper cooking and the lamp was lit. He stood in the kitchen of his home and looked at his wife and his life, and felt the full weight of it, the loss that had made him, the silence that had been a kind of death, the 2 syllables that had begun the long road back. He went to Ada and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him with the easy familiarity of a woman who was entirely at home in this. "You all right?" she said, against his chest. "Yes," he said, and this time it was completely true. That evening after supper, after James had been put to bed, and Emma had been nursed and settled, and the dishes were done, and the lamp was turned low, they sat together on the porch of the Double C in the cool September dark. The sky over New Mexico was enormous and full of stars, the way it always was out here, the Milky Way a white smear from horizon to horizon, and the planets low in the west in the last light. Ada had her feet tucked under her on the old porch chair that Clayton had repaired in the first flush of noticing things that needed attention, and her head was resting against his shoulder, and he had his arm around her in the steady and certain way of a man who knows exactly what he has and intends to keep it. There was a coyote calling somewhere out to the north, its voice lifting and falling in the dark, and the cattle were quiet in the south pasture, and the whole of the mesa country was settled into its nighttime arrangement, immense and ancient and entirely indifferent to the specific smallness of individual human lives, which was, he had come to understand, not a discouraging thought but a grounding one. The world was old and large, and it did not require anything of him except that he live honestly in it. He had spent 5 years refusing to live in it at all. He thought about the man he had been in that general store 5 years ago, the hard face, the clenched jaw, the studied blankness. The way the town moved around him with careful distance, and the way he had enforced that distance without examining whether it was actually serving him anymore, or whether it had ever been serving him, or whether it was simply the only language he had left. He thought about the woman he had not looked at when she dropped her composition book. He thought about the 2 syllables that had followed him home and would not leave him alone. Thank you, for nothing, for something, for simply seeing him. Ada, he said. She said, half drowsy against his shoulder. I want you to know something. She lifted her head slightly. Even half asleep, she gave her attention to things that mattered. Everything that I am now, he said carefully, or everything that I am now that is worth anything, I think it started that day in Prute's store when you said thank you to me for no reason, and I did not know what to do with it. I did not know how to carry a kind word. He paused. I want you to know that I know how to carry it now. Ada was quiet for a moment. He could feel her against his side, the steadiness of her, the warmth of her. Then she said, I know you do. She settled her head back against his shoulder, and the coyote called again to the north, and the stars burned over the mesa, and the lamp in the house behind them sent a warm light through the kitchen window into the dark, and Emma made a small sound in her sleep that traveled through the window and was perfectly audible in the quiet and was fine, was only a dream movement, was the sound of a child who was safe and known and loved. The double sea settled into the night around them, alive and lit and inhabited, and Clayton Carver held his wife on the porch of the life he had nearly abandoned, and he said nothing more and she said nothing more, and the silence between them was not the silence he had kept for 5 years. It was the other kind entirely, the kind that is full, the kind that is home. In the years that came after, and there were many years, good years, the kind of years that build steadily and without drama into a life that is recognizable by its depth rather than its events, the double C became what it had once been and what it now was. A working ranch and a home, distinguishable from other ranches and other homes by nothing that would appear in a ledger, but distinguishable nonetheless to the people who came to it, and felt the quality of a place where something hard had been transformed into something tender without losing its strength. Ada taught in the school she had helped to build for another 11 years, until James was old enough to have opinions about it that required addressing, and Emma had grown into a girl of quiet and formidable intelligence, who read everything in the house, and had already announced that she intended to be a doctor, which Ada received with the same steady matter-of-fact manner that she received all information, and which Clayton received with a 2-second pause followed by, "That sounds about right." Ambrose Hatch died in 1886 at the age of 71 in his bed, which was considered a good death by the standards of the New Mexico Territory, and he left Clayton the bay mare in his will, along with a note in his handwriting that said only, "I knew you would come right eventually. It took you long enough." Clayton read it twice, then folded it and put it in the box on the bedroom shelf where he kept the things that mattered. Eli Breckenridge married his young woman from town, a girl named Josephine who was sensible and kind, and who had a gift for the cattle work that surprised everyone except Eli, who had apparently known about it for some time. They built their own place on a section of land adjacent to the Double C, and the Breckenridges and the Carvers became, over the years, the kind of neighboring families that are essentially kin, the children spending their days between the two ranches with the easy fluency of children who know they are welcome everywhere they go. James, at 12, had his grandfather's teacher's quality of attention and his father's directness, and was already managing the South pasture with a seriousness that Clayton recognized as genuine competence rather than boyish imitation. He would take over the Double C someday, and this was not a thing that required planning or saying aloud. It was simply a fact that made itself clear over time, the way the best arrangements do. Emma, at 10, had already read every book on the shelves twice and had developed a habit of asking the doctor from Myra very specific questions on his visits that the doctor received with increasing respect. She had Ada's gray eyes, the same gray that shifted to blue in certain lights, and a habit of speaking directly that was entirely her own, and that made people take her seriously almost despite themselves. There was a third child, a boy named William, born in 1884, who was sunny and physical and interested in everything, who broke 2 windows in his first 4 years and climbed everything that was not moving and one thing that was, and who was adored with a specificity that came from his parents and siblings who had all, by the time he arrived, long since understood exactly what it meant to be together. On the evening of Clayton and Ada's 10th wedding anniversary, November of 1888, they went back to the rise behind the house at dusk, together this time, with the last light on the mesa and the juniper dark against the sky. The cedar crosses were weathered now, silver-gray but solid, well set in the rocky ground. Ada stood beside him and he put his hand in hers and they stood there together in the quiet. He said after a while, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For what?" "For all of it," he said. "For saying a kind word to a man who had forgotten how to hear one." Ada looked at the 2 graves and then out at the mesa and then back at him, and her eyes were bright with something that was grief and love and 10 years of life all held together in the particular way that 10 years of shared life can be held, not separate from sorrow, not pretending the losses had not happened but encompassing them, carrying them forward in the larger thing. "I did not do very much," she said. "I thanked you for nothing." "No," he said. "You saw me when I was not giving anyone much reason to." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I am glad I did." He squeezed her hand. "So am I." They stood there until the last light was gone and the stars came out over the mesa country, and then they walked back down together through the dry grass toward the house where the lamps were lit, and the children were loud, and the life they had built was waiting for them, full and whole and theirs. The Double C house had a light in every window that night, every lamp lit in every room, the warm yellow gold of it visible from a long way off across the dark mesa, like a small constellation that had agreed to hold still, which was the only kind of constellation that really mattered, the ones you could walk home to.